Have you ever seen the outcome of an election and thought to yourself, that just doesn't make sense? We get that pretty regular here in the US with our presidential elections. Over the last 20 years or so, we've had several of them where the person who got the most individual votes still lost the election because they didn't end up with enough of the so-called electoral votes. In the US presidential elections, it's the electoral votes that actually determine the winner. So this situation illustrates how elections often aren't as simple as just collecting votes. What you do with those votes after you've collected them can be just as important. So we're going to start our conversation about voting systems in this lecture with, I think, the two most basic versions, right? A majority rule versus a plurality rules. In a majority vote, all it takes to win is 50% plus one of the votes. One more than half, and you're the winner. In a plurality system, all you need are the most votes. And the person with the most votes wins. Now, what I think creates a little confusion for students sometimes, when you only have two candidates, these systems are actually the same. Right? They only diverge when there's more than three people, when there's more than two people, three or more people in the race. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples and see what some of the situations that could come up here are. So let's start off with a majority system. And just to keep things simple, let's say we have a situation where there's just 10 voters. Well, in this situation, 50% of 10 is 5. 5 plus 1 is 6. So to win this election, you need a minimum of 6 votes. Right? So if it splits up this way, right, 6 people vote one way, 4 people vote the other. That's enough. The people who voted for the green candidate here, the lower group, that's the person who wins. Now, sounds simple enough, right? But there's a problem. What if we have this situation? What if we have 5 people vote one way and 5 people vote another way? Well, now we've got a problem. Nobody made that 6 vote threshold. We've got an exact tie. Okay, so what do? Well, this is something that you need to keep in mind if you ever find yourself in a position where you're trying to come up with a voting system. What do you do in the event of ties? In every system that we're going to talk about throughout this entire chapter, this is always going to be an underlying possibility that we have to keep in mind. Okay, so how about the plurality situation? Well, again, let's take 10 voters, right, and let's assume that they split this way. Right, so we've got 4 people voted for the green candidate, 3 for the red, and 3 for the blue. Well, the green candidate, the person on the left, they got the most votes, so they're the winner. Now, they did not get a majority. Right? Remember, this is the same number of voters. The majority here is still 6, right? But they got more than everybody else. And in a plurality rules system, that's enough to get the win. Okay. So, what are some of the issues here? Well, first, as we saw, there's always a possibility of ties, right? We talked about that already, but I put it on here just for the sake of completeness. Second issue we can see with the majority system is that it has a tendency to limit the number of options, to limit the number of candidates. Again, we see that here in the U.S. Third-party candidates very rarely even try, and at least in the last century, they've never won. And the reason for that is that 50% plus 1 threshold can be tough to get when there's more than 2 candidates in the race. So this particular method, which we use in our presidential elections here in the U.S., tends to heavily favor systems where there are only 2 options, and that creates another set of issues. Right? The strength of people's opinions isn't taken into account here. Take the plurality situation. The person with the 4 votes won. Right, well, that means that 6 people didn't like that candidate. And what if you have a situation where each of those 3 people groups aren't super thrilled about the other 3 person group candidate, but they significantly prefer the green one. But let's face it, that green candidate is particularly divisive. You either love him or you hate him. So that 6-person group, they would have each been happier with either the blue candidate or red candidate than the person who actually won. So a problem with the plurality method in particular is that it doesn't take into account how much people care about the person that they're voting for versus the other candidates. So in the next lecture, we're going to take a look at something called the Boredom method. Boredom method is an example of what's called a ranked voting system. And as you'll see as we'll get into it, the reason I picked this one to go next is because it specifically addresses item 3. It gives voters an opportunity not just to say, this is the guy I like the most, but they can also say, this is the guy I like the second most and the third most, and so on down to the guy I like the least. So in the next lecture, we'll see how that method is implemented.